Hey, thanks for tuning in. This is my overall year in books, and at a higher level, I'll just be going over these in particular and just highlighting different trends and different things altogether. I think one thing I want to call attention to is that there's also a site that someone put together in which this person put together more of a summarized version in which you can get a glimpse of overall books, genres, top authors, in addition to different type ones you rated highest. I want to say it's similar to like a Spotify Wrapped or different ones, but as you can see, highlighted a lot of it was I want to say Taylor Jenkins Reid and Matt Haig swept the timeline as far as things are concerned, but a lot of more romance and contemporary fiction as far as things are concerned. Going back to the review in particular, let's get started. I'd say for this, I had a lot of bandwidth in terms of reading, and I'd, I'd include audiobooks within it because I listen particularly to a lot, and I'd say I split it, I wouldn't say evenly, but good chunk audiobooks, good chunk still reading in particular, but just a good portion, a little bit of everything this year. Seeing as with like the shortest, with more just identity based ones versus the longest one being more like a long form like work altogether. Going from there, let's see. This one would be more of a fiction based one, and then have this pulled up in the next screen here, in which this is more like I want to say it's more like sort of like an anthology type one, where it's like here's the top moments of each decade and different type ones. It was interesting to see. Like this one I got from Book Off, which is it's like a manga store slash used bookstore in New York altogether, but it's a popular chain in Japan from my knowledge. Moving from here, say say this book really resonated with me a lot this year. Not that while seeing from my appearance I am not a brown girl, but I think this did identity really well in terms of how they wrote about more their identity in terms of their space, in terms of growing up in the New York metro area. But they talked about different values and different in themes that are relevant to people within that sub-demographic of people. I think they talked about these contentious issues really well and just presented these problems that these people faced altogether really well. And I'd say talking about it in the lens of these people because as a book itself, it has sort of an interesting premise in which it doesn't really focus on, say, like a main protagonist or different things, but it's more like the collective of this group of young girls and just how they just grow up, like, and just whether it's like part ways from the initial community or like grow past it and then reconnect back in the community at large. But I think you'll better understand it if you pick up it itself. But a lot of vignettes throughout the course of things and just really interesting to see like start to finish how you get there. Past it from here, I think I'll definitely try to highlight just different ones altogether, but I'll just try to highlight ones that whether it was of interest or spoke to me one way or another, or just different ones that come up here and there. Let's see. I think this one was an interesting premise. It talks about how people are now like in an online sort of a workspace now, but they're sort of like transported where they're like I guess think of like an online workspace such as like I don't know like Slack or like an online one, but for this it's more like writing about it in the lens of these people are trapped within the confines of this and they're trying to like communicate their way out or just like sort of like find their way out of the matrix of where they're at in this novel. But it's really interesting in terms of looking at it under a fiction lens of were this to happen. It it's definitely out there, but I think it was an interesting one to say for certain though. Besides that, let's see. I think I really enjoyed Hank Green in terms of, I guess my bias is like anything related to Hank Green, but I think this is a really good introduction for him and how he tackles more talking about just like internet fame in addition to building up like this fictional world altogether surrounding it. But they have it so that there's like this breakout event that happens, and then this person gets a bunch of fame from it and what they do with it and just like how they're able to impact the surrounding world. But it touches on these issues of like internet fame and how this person sort of like navigates it altogether. Meanwhile, just like doing this the storytelling bit of just making it like a complex space where you're still invested in the different like characters they have in the roster. As I think for me, where it's having grown up with like John Green books, I feel like John Green books are they have like an archetype where it's like your main character lead, you have like a side character, then the romantic interest, and then like this bizarre or like I don't know, just like bizarre leading incident happens, and then like it throws a wrench into things, and then a bunch of series of random events happens. I think Hank does interesting work on himself that established himself differently from his brother John, but it was a really great stint, that one from Hank, and end up like reading different ones from him altogether as well. Let's see. Sorry, that was a tangent because I'm just a huge fan of them overall. I think the I think for Hazelwood, I was a huge fan of the Monster, and I'd say similarly, but I don't think I have like additional commentary or like feedback I can really provide. I think it's like if you're a fan of her work altogether, you sort of know what to expect, and different like renditions of it are interesting still and like captivating for people who are like fans of her altogether. This one I was really captivated initially having. Oh, so it was watch the series on a flight, like the pilot, binging the series on the way home, and then sort of like diving into the books and the sort of like whole premises of these. This was a really popular one last year in which, or I'd say contemporary fiction wise, in addition like book club and different things I was looking at. But for this, I'd say I really enjoyed having it have connections with more. I'd say it has connections with like gaming in addition to identity and just more like romance adjacent ones. And it sort of just tries to tie it all together in terms of like start to finish, just more game development side, but also building on like the pros of I guess just like all the things that happen in terms of the book overall, and just sort of like drags it over the finish line. I think for me it was like overhyped in particular. I'd say I tried to look at it through a pretty ambiguous lens. So with that, it's like enjoyed it for what it was worth, but I tried to not look at it like hype perspective at least. Constance Wu, I remember vividly reading this at a book at like an Asian bookstore I was in. It was a bookstore called You and Me, based in New York at the moment. But pretty much this is autobiographical work. Constance Wu, from my understanding, this was paralleling her experience upon which she took a break from social media and she had faced a lot of backlash due to comments she had made upon Fresh Off the Boat and different works she was a part of, and not being really welcomed within communities or spaces she was in, and sort of talking about her history to where she got to her point and different things she was working on past that point and just her recovery and what she's doing now altogether. Let's see. Say it's another John Green book. Thoroughly enjoyed. I think for this, I think for John Green books, I think the ones I really like was his, and I really liked his anthology one. In addition to, I want to say Looking for Alaska, in addition to The Fault in Our Stars initially for those ones. But I think if I had to like rank every individual John Green books, that would be a video unto itself. But I think Turtles is definitely up there in terms of different ones, but it's not a standout one for me at least. Yeah, this was the one I was mentioned, like the Anthropocene reviewed. That this one really stood out for me in terms of something I really enjoyed because it's an anthology that talked about things that was really like contentious hot button issues, but it jumps back and forth in terms of different topics, different subject matters altogether that kept my attention. And then it's like I'll have to skip these. Not that they didn't capture my attention in particular, but it's that I don't think I'm as much of a science fiction or fantasy person as I'd like to admit. And I try to not hold that bias one way or another, but I just try them, like finish them, but then sort of struggle to pick up another one. I think for me, it's just like trying to get as much exposure for me as possible, but just trying to take that perspective. At the same time, I was also looking at books that was cementing my experience in New York City at the time. It was interesting to see like perspective of different voices within the city, such as like this one was more like African heritage and sort of how they navigated their space into like their city and sort of how like New York City has these different like villages and different spaces where people can make themselves present, but more like a fictional lens of how this person found their footing and sort of their narrative of how their character got there in particular. Hmm. But yeah, I remember this one was more like a publishing lens in particular, and just sort of just from their start of like their adventure in a new city and like how they went about it. I think for this one, this was more like an infographic type one of, sorry, misspoke, not infographic, more like informational one about like asexuality and like identity in particular. This one I remember I picked up a physical copy where I got more involved into mutual aid in particular, but I was more interested in terms of more the dynamics of it as a whole, because they sort of broke down like what differentiates like mutual aid and nonprofits, but they're talking about how mutual aid there's not as like clearly delineated like power structures in terms of like leadership levels or like how power is distributed versus more so like a nonprofit has like president, directors, and like different like managerial or like leadership type roles. Or mutual aid, it's sometimes like more spread out, like evenly in terms of everybody's contributing equally. And here's what happens if there's like a fissure in terms of like power dynamics or just like imbalance of power or like different conflicts and how they're resolved. It was really interesting to pick up and just sort of see how those were reflected in real world and past and take it in terms of learning altogether. I think Weike Wang, I really enjoyed her fiction work. She does a lot more in terms of, I want to say it's at the intersection of identity in addition to more the career space. For this one, it was more about like young profession. I, I need a refresher real quick for this one. I want to say it's young professional, they're in a PhD. Okay, yeah. So young professional, they're in a PhD and they're like juggling like their interpersonal relationships in addition to what awaits them in terms of like a PhD in addition to different things, and just seeing how she's able to navigate this space altogether. For central spaces, sorry, misspoke. For essential places, for this one, I'd say it's definitely parallel in terms of structure, but it's more so uh, this main character brings home um, their partner who just has a different identity than what their parents might be approving of, and sort of what plot unfolds from there is like how the main character in this story is able to navigate that and have that conversation with their parents, in addition to their partner that was involved in the story, and just sort of how they're able to navigate that space from there. Rough Sleepers, I vividly remember this was when I was involved with. Um, there was a housing mutual aid group that visited the city that was initially based in Boston. It was for the Winter Walk, but they distributed copies of this book in which it talked about this professor's experience and how this person did a lot of work in terms of like on the ground work that was more in terms of aid work throughout these different communities and how they just kept at it throughout the years and how it's impacted their practice in terms of when they practice like this more like I guess like still being involved in mutual aid aspect of things, but now being like a practitioner in the medical field, like seeing it under that lens as well. I briefly looked at some work from Camus, and for this, I think where I do like break it down further, I need to like a video type breakdown for this, but I think I've scratched the surface of the philosophies of like Camus and different ones as well. I just need to make sure afterwards I was pronouncing this name right. This was a recommendation from one of the bartenders at UNM, but my understanding Minji Lee, her work is known for Pachinko, which was a different one. But Free Food for Millionaires was another book of hers that explored differing contentious issues at time being. I think a standout one for me this year was definitely Olga Dies Streaming. This one talked about issues such as once they talked about identity gentrification in addition to more radical ideas at a time, and talks about it through the lens of the main character's like direct connections, whether it's her family, like her parents, in addition to just her circle of general groups, and just sort of focuses the lens on just like what happens throughout the course of the novel and what happens with respect to like these political issues, social justice, and everything under that lens. I know that I just threw a bunch of like these different buzzwords at you, but I'd say that if you want one that more covers these different issues, this one has you covered in terms of talking about more. I'd say it covers a lot about like Puerto Rico's like politics and the systems they have at play. But it was an interesting read from this breakout novel from Sochito, at least. No, she has another one coming out within I want to say within this year at least. This one was interesting. My understanding is this one now has a Netflix, sorry, misspoke, a Hulu adaptation, but my understanding is that this one was about how this woman functioned in a corporate environment, and now she has another person who is also like a person of color, and just seeing like is this person giving like an ally or a disruptor, or like in what capacity is she gonna be joined at from this complete stranger who comes through her in this new environment altogether, and how she sort of navigates it. Okay, so for this was eventually actually like looking at like the works of Amy Poehler in particular. For this one, I know the year prior, a lot of it was focused on audiobooks of famous comedians, uh, in particular like Tina Fey, Colin Jost, and different ones. But eventually got to the one by Amy Poehler in particular. Oh, it's that from before. Sad to skip through a couple, not that they're not of significance, but I just don't have like strongly laced like commentary for them. I think this one was interesting. I think for this one I was reluctant to review, but I sort of got this interest in the middle, but it was more like Anthony Bourdain's stab at making like a mystery type fiction novel. I really like his like Kitchen Confidential one though, in addition to his other works. I enjoyed this one in particular. This one was by Raphael Bob Waksberg, in which he's also affiliated with like BoJack Horseman in particular, and I really respect his work from there. And I just wanting to see like in written form other media, like what other media is he like producing and just like working on at the time, and it really spoke to me in terms of the story he wrote about. From here, I'd say timeline wise, this corresponded with to my move eventually to the Boston area, but for this, I got into reading books around like fitness and general running again. Excuse me. But for this one, it was just looking at different people's journey in the running space, but also looking at just different routes, different things that people are able to do in particular. I feel bad for sort of like lumping these together, but it's sort of, I want to say right now, a lot of the media I consume would be just like running related one, whether it's like Molly Seidel or like Courtney Duwa, or in addition to other people within the space, and just wanting to discontinuing in terms of like the running space and active space altogether. Also, I'm gonna feel bad if I like butcher those names or mispronounce those altogether. I think the Prince Harry one was interesting, in which I know on TikTok at least people are like stitching the more like explicit content. That was more the commentary on it. But I think it was a good overview of his life in particular from early conception into just like the later stages of his life, whether it's like drafting and joining like military forces into just like conversations with her parents or relatives, in addition to what shaped him and just like different central focal points in his life that made him who he is today, and sort of getting there in particular. I'd say R.F. Kuang's work here really spoke to me, in which I think this was one I finished just in a sitting altogether. Just it's really captivating, and it's like I just can't fully talk about it without sort of like spoiling it. But I think for this, it was more about like somebody who I yeah I have a hard time describing this one, but it's more so just following the paper trail of like a novel and just like a create. I want to say it's like different authors in particular, and just like follow, following them in particular, and just like seeing where it leads them all together. And it was really interesting to see this piece in particular, especially from R.F. Kuang, where I'm more familiar with them from their sci-fi type work, but it was interesting to see their work of fiction at least. I think for Hunt, yeah, I think these books by them I'd have to dissect further in like, I don't want to say video essay, I'd say just like in the video in itself, where this one sort of focuses on a couple of people through like the long run in particular in their life in a city, and this one more focuses on this bio. I want to say it's more of the scientist's study of a long-term study within just like this indigenous population, and just seeing how they interact with the everyday people there, and just that's the main focal point of it altogether, and just come, running come through it, and just like sort of building a narrative throughout the course of the book. This one's Joe Bastia, and I remember picking this up when I was in Boston's North End and sort of just perusing books, but for this it was interesting to hear about Joe's history, where he went to Boston College. He did his more like a finance stint, but then he went into more of the cooking realm, and having to like sort of see like going from, I think I vividly remember he was talking about how he wanted to talk about how he was like a buyer for more like wines and in the food and beverages space, and seeing like how he later did different things with his restaurant career and how he got to the point where he was today. But I think he also broke down like the economics of, I guess, like restaurants in some capacities, but also just speaking like sort of speculatively about all these items as well. But I'd say it was interesting for what it was worth. Richard Osman was more book club books in particular, but it follows an unconventional group of characters where they're known as the Thursday Murder Club, and they sort of like investigate and look at these different cases all across the board and see how they're able to lend a hand in these different ones that come about, and just follows it throughout the court. I think for these, I wouldn't say I'm not a fan, but at the same time, I wouldn't say I'm a strong fan of these. As I'd say, main bread and butter right now would be like more the romantic fiction or contemporary fiction type ones, or just like yeah, just contemporary fiction. Curtis Feld is more of a standout one to me, but it was more about, I'd say, take the example, say like an SNL and a producer of it, and how you have to book different talents, whether it's like actors, musicians, or different type people. This one is about a producer and how she is affiliated with booking a talent, but then sort of has a romantic thing with them, and what unfolds from there, whether they're exchanging emails or just seeing how they want to evolve their more like romance that they have across the board and see if they want to continue with it, or seeing how they want this situationship of theirs to unfold altogether as it runs throughout like the course of the book. Chain Gang All Stars was one that was, I'd say it's very out there. I think it's one I just need to pull out the description, but I'd have to say the word. So keywords I want to say was like prison and then battles, because I think they sort of capture it better, but it's sort of like these gladiator fights where you sort of just like have to like rank up and like build up like experience until you're actually like freed in particular. And you sort of have like this like continued tier system until you're like seeing freedom at the end of the day, sort of getting there. It's an interesting work. This was an interesting one in which this person's communicating with this octopus through the course of the book, and it was interesting to see that this was more of a piece in which the octopus had more like fully functioning in terms of like a memory and being able to communicate with others and being able to have this sort of like brain capacity from themselves, but they were actively able to interact with the outside world and just make just like these fruitful interactions with them overall. On the other hand, you have this main character where it's an older woman who is just going through the motions of everyday life and sort of being, I don't like saying the word stuck, but she's just doing her job altogether, but just they're able to keep themselves company at the end of the day through going through the lens of the course of the book itself. Let's see. I'd say Roses in the Mouth of the Lion gives me memories of Brown Girls, but at the same time, it gives me memories of other different perspectives of more of these Asian perspectives of whether it's like just more like I think the word is like Bildungsroman, where it's more the contemporary growing up stages of life. That's more portrayed through, say, Perks of Being a Wallflower or different ones, but those are more like white perspectives as opposed to like people of color. But this one talks more about it through the lens of being a person of color and having these topical issues, and just highlighting those different lenses in particular. Oh, this was when I got into the rabbit hole of Taylor Jenkins Reid and everything mixed with it. So for this one, this was about Daisy Jones and the Six. This was about the character of Daisy Jones and how she joins a group of people in terms of making this music group and the studio albums that they release in addition to all the events that follow that, and just I guess the romantic feelings and different things that Daisy comes across being more like young and immature at the time of being. But it was interesting to see in particular. My previous exposure would be Evelyn Hugo and her work from before, but it was interesting to see under the lens of this. Uh, Maybe in another life captures perspective of a late 20s person where they lived in a lot of different cities, but this time around they meet with an old connection and sort of seeing like what different timelines could occur from there, and sort of just explores it throughout the course of the novel in terms of staying in Los Angeles or entertaining different things that might occur throughout the life that she lives. This work was from a person of color where they were talking about working more corporate side, about their work overall, and just seeing what they're able to do while going through the motions of everyday life in this corporate world. But I wouldn't say it's like that's the main point, but a lot of it is has that as the perspective overall. But a lot of it highlights that in addition to I want to say trends of like underemployment in addition to going through emotions, the mental health and different things, even though they're not necessarily like explicitly spoken about. But a lot of it has like trends of sorry, I misspoke, like values of those overall. I want to say this one's about. I want to say this one is about a librarian and a little kid. Yeah, a librarian, little kid. But for this one, it's pretty much there's a little kid who goes to the library a lot, and there's a librarian that's with her, sorry, with him being the little kid, and just seeing how this person is able to operate, where through a series of different events, not series.
Okay, I found this on the web for a series of different events. Check it out.
Yes, thank you, sir. Okay, so from here, it's seeing what happens is that the kid ends up in the librarian's car, and the librarian wants to pretty much see how she is able to navigate herself from here. Because I think a lot of the inciting incidents were that the kid's parent is really anti. I want to say it's like anti-intellectualism in certain ways in terms of limiting access to types of book that this person has in store, and just sort of censoring them in a certain way. But the librarian in particular wants to open this person's worldview and sort of see how they go about it through that lens. But for this one, it's a very interesting story in particular, but take it with a grain of salt because everything, well, uh, uh, most if not all of these I've read are more fiction related, but sort of stretch it in particular. So just know with that going in. This one, this was another standout one for me, but I'd say this one was about more of an immigrant's perspective of them, and it reviews more employment type papers of how this person fills out these different employment type papers. But through the narration of it, you really hear the emotion and more of, I, I'd say you get to hear just how this character conducts themselves in a way, whether it's like the methods of which they fill out the employment papers or interacts with everyday people or just all the little things that add up to making the story. But it was well worth a listen to this person's journey of getting employment and being like an immigrant within the States. This one in particular is about this tech slash consumer writer where previously she has that type of work within the SF area and seeing if she wants to make a transition with her partner to, I want to say they move to the, seeing if they want to move to the Ithaca area for their partner and sort of balancing that in terms of the trade-off that comes with choosing career versus supporting their partner who is going for more schooling and also talking about more contentious issues of identity in addition to being a person in color in mostly these white spaces and just different things along the lines of that. This was another interesting Taylor Jenkins Reid one where they have a perspective of where this one's like modern day versus like, well, I'd say there's like a time gap where it sort of like jumps in between like two distinct timelines and one's before an incident and one's like precisely afterwards and seeing like how you go through the acts of that. I really like this one. This is from someone who's never read or really known about Peter Cameron's work before, but for this one, this is about a little kid where, well, not little kid, I want to say teenager, where he goes to more of a program that's meant to help boost him for college applications altogether. Like, say it's like a summer professional program or like different and more like advancement program for simplicity's sake. For this one, he has an inciting incident where that causes a bunch of problems that trickles down from. And in the aftermath, he is sort of questioning just what he wants to do after he graduates. Does he want to even go to college? And just a lot of it that comes with this identity of his, of being this really high achiever with really high expectations and seeing that the world is ahead of him and seeing the weight of the world being on his shoulders and not knowing what he wants to do. I'd say this is a really standout one in terms of touching upon like all these issues from more of this adolescent perspective of his. Oh, at this time I also got a bit into Frederick Bachman, where this one was more about I think I can really sum it up with like hockey and conflict without spoiling it, but it was interesting to see where it was about. Dava Shastri's last day was really captivating to me, in which it was about, so it's pretty much about this mogul in which pretty much they wanted to see what the general public thought of her passing days before her passing. So it would be just announced that she died of a different thing, and just getting engaged on what the pulse of the land was in terms of their general reactions of it. But in the aftermath of that, just seeing just what unfolds from there in terms of the power dynamics at play, in terms of how they see Dava Shastri, in terms of this really wealthy magnate. And by people, I mean the family members, relatives, and different people that are involved with that with Dava Shastri, and how she is able to relate and connect with these different people. But just seeing how end of day she wants to leave this legacy, but she also wants to see the impact of her legacy and how that is construed by the general public. I'd say it has a really strong start, but middle ending, I wouldn't say it's bad. I wouldn't say it's great. I'd say it's like uh, middle line-ish, but I'd say it's an interesting premise onto itself. Inca, Where Is Your Husband is an interesting one. So for this one, it's about Inca, in which she's a person in which she's very career focused, being more an analyst type person in her day job, but seeing more pressures in terms of family, relatives, and different people, in terms of sort of just how she wants to find a partner and just sort of navigating that space. So a good portion of the novel is about having that conversation and seeing how she's going to get there in the first place, and just the series of different events that occur throughout. Oh, here goes Siri again.
Okay, I found this on the web for S of different events that occur brought out. Check it out.
I think from here I'm going to have to skip Game of Thrones, because I think it's, once again, I need to look at next one and just sort of see from there in terms of how I finish it. As I'd say, I'm a Game of Thrones fan at the moment being, but I need to sit down and dedicate time to it, rather than say like, not that I'm like speeding through these, but it's like I can finish a book in a good amount of time, but mentally processing the book and just like fully going through it, I need to leave more for a Game of Thrones type one. Gang Leader for a Day was rather interesting. So this one was about this sociology student and how they physically go into the streets of this individual place. Oh, here they are again. But it was interesting to me, in which I'd say it fell flat to me near the ending because it wasn't realistic to me, since it was more memoir type one, but they had to write about it from their realistic perspective. But at the same time, just I had, I don't want to say doubts per se, but I felt some of it wasn't really sure how to connect with it, in terms of knowing that these are really dangerous spaces in which, say, this person's in like projects or like different places where it's very unsafe spaces, and just sort of having to navigate that and being able to sort of like listen to your gut instinct and carry on your composure that way. But I'd say it was interesting in terms of seeing how they navigated it, but I just wasn't too sure the length to which I was able to follow alongside of it in particular. I guess the reason being would be how well they integrate within this sort of a group in which they connect well with the one or a few leaders within this inner circle of a gang, and over the course of time sort of becomes one of them. Because I think the closest experience I've had would be doing work on, say, a Skid Row and just working with unhoused and different ones. And I think it's fair to say that I was able to connect with some people who are in those spaces a certain amount of time. But I'd say even after a good amount of time, I wasn't able to fully be like, I guess, go into their spaces and live like how they live and sort of be able to recount the story like that. I don't think that it's like a positive or a negative thing one way or another, but it's more just observing that in this perspective. They call this exceptionary, sorry, they call this exceptional was really good work in particular in which this person highlights their identity of expectations that they had, but just highlighting it under the lens of more, I want to say, touch upon like mental health in terms of different contentious issues, but they also highlight, say, like toxic masculinity in addition to different traits through the lens of her brother, but also toxic familial traits through different parents and being able to relate with that and different issues that she's able to speak to from like being like first generation sort of a background and sort of being able to tap into and relate to that in series. This one was a short piece about, well, as in title indicates, a convenience store woman, in which I'd say it's more like a slice of life one where it's more you sort of just get a glimpse of this person's experience within the space and just the different type of people she's able to interact with and what's expected of her within just being doing that job in particular. I think at a surface she also talks about like identity and how she's not sure how to really handle herself in terms of more socially, in terms of her home space and relative to like, oh, I do this type of work or different type things when talking about like relationships and different things. But talked about like those and different type values throughout the course. One's this one talks about, say, it's more like an intergenerational story in which it goes through early story of different immigrants and then they go through like college ages, different other ones. Then they talk about like next generation over and their college experiences and going further from there. I'd say it also talks about just distinct intergenerational histories in particular, but it follows the main story of different people throughout the course and sort of like treads the line of here's where like sort of divides into like who's doing what and different problems people are facing. It was interesting to follow like the timelines of different people. The Humans was about, so it was about these aliens in which the aliens are here to destroy any evidence of this professor that solve this really famous proof that would lead to advancement in terms of human society, and pretty much making it so that there's no trace of it. Because for this, if the proof were solved, it would lead to a lot of advancement, and it might pose a threat to aliens. So the alien who was on call for this assignment takes form of the professor, and the professor's dead, so the alien is posing as him, and he's sort of trying to fit in as the professor and sort of like conduct himself in the way he is supposed to be, also experiencing the human experience and just trying to see how to live it all together. And then Hana-Con carries on was about this family that runs a halal restaurant and how it's the staple one in town, and how there's another one that shows up that's a main competitor, and how they're going to navigate this space. But besides that, Hana-Con is also in charge of an anonymous podcast that talks about contentious issues for people of color, sort of focusing on that. I'd say the most inciting incident that happens is that hate crime that happens, and sort of seeing how it unfolds from there as it tells more of a compelling story from people of color perspective. But yeah, I'd say together that was summing up a bunch of different books in particular and just walking through different ones. I think the ones that spoke to me most was definitely like Taylor Jenkins Reid, Matt Haig, and just the overall trends I saw was reading a lot about more people of color wanting to read more about their stories, and just a good bit of like contemporary slash romantic ones. Made it this far. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, don't forget to be awesome.